Hello and welcome to our webinar entitled The Business of Being a Decorative Concrete Contractor. My name is Tiffany and I will be your operator for today's call. At this time, all phone participants are in a listen-only mode. You may submit a question at any time by using the Q&A feature to the right of the presentation. Simply type a question in the area at the bottom and click the button to send. Later, we will conduct a question and answer session. Please note that this conference is also being recorded. I will now turn the call over to Joe Primavera. You may begin.
Thank you very much, Tiffany, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Really appreciate you guys taking the time out of your busy schedules. As if you are a contractor, then this is an extremely busy time of year for you, so we really appreciate you taking the time today to join us. And before we get started today, what I'd like to do is kind of give you the why this session, why now, and what we're planning on doing. We were charged the Decorative Concrete Council was kind of talking about some things and how we could bring some content to the contractors, to the members, that was the kind of content that they're looking for. So we asked them. And by asking a series of contractors, we kept getting the same kind of result, and that was we need more information about how to run our business, how to be successful with the business that we have chosen to be in, which is decorative concrete. So what we decided to do was we decided to do a specialized series of webinars. We're calling them the DCC webinar series on business topics, and we're starting with this one today. And what I want to do is explain to you who we are and then what this is going to be about. So with any further ado, my name is Joe Primavera. I'm Vice President of Sales and Marketing for Sundec. We're a decorative concrete company. I have been in the business almost 30 years now. I've done a little bit of everything from the contracting side to the manufacturing side. And I've got a couple folks here that are going to help me through not only this presentation, but the series. This is one of 5 that we're going to do. And we'll get into the specifics of what those 5 will be a little bit later. Also here to help me is a gentleman by the name of Frank Lewis. He's the Vice President, he's the Senior Vice President of Sundec Products. He is a former Council Director of the Decorative Concrete Council, and he's actually a member of the Decorative Concrete Hall of Fame. I also have Melinda McCall. Melinda is Sundec's Vice President of Resource Development. In a former life, she worked for Coca-Cola and Dr. Pepper. She was also the CEO of a small tech company. Between the 3 of us, we have a lot of experience not only with decorative concrete, but with business and with what it takes to run a business. So what we're going to do in this first of 5 is we're going to talk about the key components you should be looking at and analyzing and diving a little bit deeper in to see if your business is running the way it should and where you should be. So with that, what I'd like to do is pass it off to Melinda, otherwise known as Mel. Mel, it's all yours.
Thanks, Joe. Good afternoon, everyone. Let's take a deep dive into what got you in this business, because I know that each of our backgrounds is probably a little bit different. When we look across the landscape of decorative concrete contractors, we understand that there are a lot of family businesses, and these businesses typically fit into one of 3 categories. One being that they've got an entrepreneurial drive about them. So maybe they've left corporate America. The founders left corporate America and decided to start a business, and they picked decorative concrete as their product or service, and they've left a career behind. The other way that people kind of happen into this industry is they have a contracting business doing some other product or service or installation, and they decide to add a decorative concrete element to their existing business. And then finally, the other big bucket of how people get into our industry is around succession planning. And maybe it was my father started the business and I'm taking over from my father or my mother. Or I've worked for a long-time decorative concrete contractor and now I am buying the business from that owner. So no matter which way you came into this industry, there are some things that cross all of these buckets, and that is how you should be running your decorative concrete business. So no matter if you've been in a business before and had a great deal of experience, or if you're a true artist and really the business side of it is the part that you don't spend as much time on, our goal today in this webinar series is to focus on what can we do, no matter what your background, to bring everybody to the same conversation, and that way we can focus on the key performance indicators that will help you in running a successful decorative concrete business. So we acknowledge that no matter what type of business you're in, there are some primary constraints that we all face, and these are the obvious ones: time, money, and people. Only 24 hours in a day, 7 days in a week, and 52 weeks in that year. We have limited capital to put towards growth of our company and limited labor resources as the war for talent continues, especially in services and the construction industry in general. So hurdling these constraints is something that we're all focusing on. So how do we continue to manage these constraints while also focusing in on being more successful in the business of what we're doing? I spoke recently to Charlie Plunk, who is the CEO of Sundeck, and I asked him, what has it taken to be a successful decorative concrete contractor within the Sundeck dealer network over the last 40 years? And this is what he had to say. It takes something pretty special to be a decorative concrete installer. Passionate and talented people, high-quality products, back office support, and laser focus on the critical elements that drive profitability of your business. So what I want to focus on is that laser focus, the profitability. How do we bring those sales revenue dollars at the top all the way down through the bottom of your business and drive profit at the end of the year? So we're going to focus on that profitability. So laser focus on critical elements, and that focus is going to be our number one component of the 5 webinar series. We're going to focus on 5 fundamental elements that will bring you better business efficiencies, which will drive that profitability. So as we looked at what are the top 5 things we should be looking at, the obvious component for us was looking at the profit and loss statement. Now, you may not currently put together a profit and loss statement, or you may have been looking at profit and loss statements for the last 20, 25 years. So no matter where you are in this spectrum, we're going to take you through the fundamentals that we look at in the key performance indicators that should drive your focus. So let's jump into what those are. Now, this is a bit of an eye chart, but let me walk you through this. So as a decorative concrete contractor, this would be a typical profit and loss statement. So on the far left, that column talks about the components of a basic profit and loss statement. This is a simplified one, but it definitely gives you the highlights. The second column is the amount that you might expect in that category in each of the components. The third column is what's concluded. What are the things that are included in each of those buckets? And then on the fourth column, the one on the far right, it's what's an acceptable range or a goal to have in that bucket or that category as you develop your profit and loss statement. So let's take a closer look. So as we talk about sales, now some people use the word revenue, some people call it sales. We're talking the same thing, sales and revenue, when we're talking about what it looks like on the profit and loss statement. So let's say you sold $1 million worth of decorative concrete last year. You sold $1 million worth of decorative concrete, and that was installed in the 2014 timeframe. Hopefully that's between 5 and 15% more than you sold the year before. You want to have controlled growth, specifically because of those constraints I talked about a few minutes ago of time, people, and money. If you have a controlled growth, then you're not going to get your sales out of whack from your production capability to install it. If you've got controlled growth, you can bring the company along, the sales talent you have and the production or installation talent you have, and those can work in parallel or in conjunction. So the line just below that is the cost of goods sold. Typically, a cost of goods sold is broken into 2 major components, the materials and the labor. And this typically is between 50 and 60% of your sales or your revenue. So a good estimate, if you look at how much it cost you to buy the materials that you installed last year and pay the people that installed those materials last year, then that item, those 2 combined, is your cost of goods sold. So if you take that sales minus your cost of goods sold, that's going to bring you to your gross profit. That's also called gross margin. So depending, you might hear it coined both ways. This is the money you have left over to pay your other bills. And it's typically between 30 to 50% of sales, depending on how you buy materials and what your labor costs are in your specific market. So moving down the page, the next area is operating expense. This is the stuff that you need to run your business. This is keeping the lights on, paying the phone bill, paying someone to answer the phone. This is paying your accountant and paying the person that files your taxes at the end of the year, your CPA. This is the money that you don't spend on actually installing or buying material. So this is all those leftover items. And this is an area that can get really out of control pretty quickly. You might know some individuals that start a business and they go out and they buy a shiny building and put brand new furniture in before they've got the revenue. That's a big concern because their operating expenses are upside down to their sales. So this we want to keep between 30 and 40%. Closer to the 30% is certainly optimal, but anywhere in this range is acceptable. Below that line, if you take your gross profit and subtract your operating expense, that lands us at the bottom of that profit and loss statement, and that's your net income. This is the profit you get to slide in your pocket. This is the money you made. And the goal is that you would be anywhere between 5 and 15% of sales. Now you'll note that fourth column over there is always listed as a percentage of sales. Now you may have heard the term top line. What's your top line? Top line is sales. It's that top line, sales or revenue. And when people talk about the bottom line, that's net income. That's the very bottom of your profit and loss statement. So the goal is, how do you drive sales and bring it to the bottom line, that net income? Joe, add something to that.
Well, Mel, excellent point. And one of the things, especially for the smaller dealer, you got to make sure that you pay yourself as if you were an employee of your company. Some folks we've run into in the past when we've dealt with contractors, they don't pay themselves as an employee of the company, or they're paying themselves a salary. That salary, the commissions, if they're doing the install work themselves, that all has to be applicable and put in the right category, so you know if you bring those people on later, how that's going to come out in this form when you start to analyze how your business is doing. Because you're paying yourself to do functions within the business. Those need to be allocated correctly.
That's a great point, Joe. So in that cost of goods sold line, that includes the cost to have you in the business. So pretend you were not the owner of the business. What would you pay yourself to do your function? If you're primarily sales or predominantly production management, your salary should be in that cost of goods sold line. Great point, Joe. Thanks for that. So I've just given you a whole lot of gobbledygook going through the profit and loss statements. Let me tell you how we're going to break it down in this webinar series for each of the 5 components of the series, because we're going to go way in the weeds. This was a high-level brushstroke, but now let's talk about how we're going to go into the details. So for today, we're going to focus this first webinar specifically on cost of goods sold and driving efficiencies within the material. Frank Lewis is going to talk quite a bit about what you can do as a business owner running a decorative concrete company to reduce your cost of goods sold related to the materials and products that you're installing. In the next webinar that will happen in September, we're going to talk about the other side of cost of goods sold, which is labor. It's the people. This is where your salary is. This is where your employees' salary are. So these 2 components we're breaking into 2 webinars because it's so very important to watch your direct costs. Direct costs are specifically in that cost of goods sold bucket. Then we're going to take another look on the 3rd webinar series as we go down the profit and loss statements. The next area was operating expenses, and that's where the 3rd series will focus on how do you gain better efficiencies and reduce your operating expenses. Are you as efficient as you can be with all of that other stuff, all of the other accounting and your payroll expenses and all the other stuff? So we're going to give you some insights on tips and tricks on what you can do to lower those costs specifically. Then we're going to drop to the very bottom. Then we're going to jump to the top. That top is going to be how do we drive sales? That sales is driving top-line revenue. How do you get more leads? How do you convert those leads and bring those leads into paying customers? So that's the fourth component, and we'll go into internet as well as in-person, residential, commercial, all focused on decorative concrete specifics. And then the final, we'll wrap everything up. We'll drop all the way to the bottom of the page in the net income. And our final point in this webinar series, which will happen in December, is getting more dollars to the bottom line. And we're going to be tying together when things work in parallel, things that happen in cost of goods sold and what the downstream effect of it is in your operating expenses and in your gross margin. So we'll tie those components together. So that's the focus for this 5-part series of the Decorative Concrete Council's education on the business. So now I'd like to turn this over to Frank Lewis. Frank's going to talk specifically about cost of goods sold and materials, the first component of this series. And Frank, the platform's yours.
All right. Thank you, Mel. Let's start with the definition, which is, what is the definition of cost of goods sold? Now, according to Investopedia.com, the definition of cost of goods sold, that is COGS, the direct costs that are attributable to the production of the goods sold by a company. This amount includes the cost of the materials used in creating the final product. Now, we may have a variety of decorative concrete contractors on the phone. We may have overlay contractors, cast-in-place concrete guys, but these are the raw goods, or the goods that go into creating that final product. That's what we're going to talk about today, is how do we control those costs? And I'd like to preface right up front, is really a big part of this is managing the paperwork that goes with that. Mel had talked about a profit and loss statement. Now, profit and loss statement is actually a history account. This is what happened a quarter ago or a month ago. Whereas having an accurate job or a work order on your job and then have a work order that matches to that, those are snapshots. That's what happened to that job within a very short period of time. And most of our decorative work is pretty short work. We don't usually drag it on past a week or two or even a month in most of our work. So I'm going to suggest that if you really want to monitor and measure how effective you are in managing your material costs, make sure that you've got a proper work order. A work order that describes the scope of that job, what the material breakdown should be, what are the consumables, what's the part of that job that's going to, material-wise, that's going to take to do it profitably. And you won't know that if you don't have a proper work order to go with that, because that work order should describe exactly what goes into that job. And that's going to make a lot of sense as I go through these different tips. And once you have that work order in place and you finish the job, I highly recommend that you do a job costing on it almost immediately, so you can see how effective you are and if you are bidding these jobs correctly and if you're managing the jobs correctly. So let's look at some tips that might be of help to you, and one of these is to, besides the job cost and the work order, is to get to know what your lead times are to obtain materials. And whether you're scheduling concrete for the next week or whether you're ordering overlay materials, freight is always a big part, especially when it comes to overlay materials. But if you know the scope and depth of that job, you're going to know exactly what needs to go with it. You can place a proper order for it, and you can do the job in an effective and efficient manner. So know what those lead times are and know what the scope of your work is. The other part too, and this is an interesting tip, is to establish a strong relationship with your suppliers. Whether you're buying from a material supply house or you're buying from a ready-mix contractor, those relationships are so critical because they will give you some preferential treatment, especially when you need materials in a just-in-time manner. You really don't want to pay extra for if you have a shortage of stain or you've got a shortage of products to finish the job, you're going to end up paying a premium for it. But if you've got a relationship with your suppliers, more than likely you can get that job finished and get your check. We've got a note here about negotiating bulk pricing when possible. Not sure how you guys buy. If you're part of a larger organization or a co-op product, you can order materials ahead of time. You can buy by pallets. You can buy by gallons, 5 gallons. Buying materials that you use on a regular basis. Try buying, instead of buying quarts and pints or small bags, try buying in pallet loads. You can probably save a lot of material and get you just through the season. Another thing too is we want to know where our materials are going, and this ties back in with that work order and that job cost, and measuring where our products go. Are they being wasted? Are they being installed correctly? Are we having go-backs on jobs that we shouldn't be? Having your monthly inventory will help you control a lot of your costs. And hey, Joe.
Hey, Frank. Question. You bring up some great points. One of the things that it's about the systems. I think everything Frank talked about right here is about some systems, and that's even reflecting back. If you've got data from year to year that you can reflect back on and see what your inventory or purchase habits are and those kinds of things, you can prepare and get prepared for the upcoming year. I think in a great way. And I think that's what Frank's talking about really ultimately, is to have some systems in place, have some recording items in place so that you can basically forecast what's going to happen. So you have an idea in the month of May, in the month of July, when things start to peak and build up, you can have some expectations set and be prepared.
You know, that's interesting too, Joe. You remind me of a lot of the trips that I make to different contractors in the ASDC and our own organization. Is you'll walk into the warehouse and there's always this special corner where it's all dusty and a lot of spiders and stuff live over there, and it's a huge pile of oddball looking stuff that's dated 1999, and you ask the contractor, what is all this stuff here? And it's stuff that they over-ordered or they didn't need, or they didn't follow that inventory, and it'd be surprising, but they were add a lot of that up, it would be a matter of thousands of dollars of stuff that's just sitting there rotting. So that's why that managing that inventory and keeping control of it will get rid of that big pile of stuff that sits in the dark corner. And also, we just did a safety seminar this morning, and it's just amazing that in all this ordering and all these jobs that we do, and I know in ASDC we really stress safety. And safety costs a bit of money too, and we want to make sure that all these jobs that we're on, that we provide all the safety materials that we need, including goggles, back braces, everything that goes along with the prescribed ASDC safety program, and that's got to be part of every job that we do. This is something, the next one, this item here is, do we have everything for the job and avoid the trips back to the shop? I always make a little bet with my production managers and the crew leaders. I says, from the looks that I see on this job, we may have 2 trips to Home Depot here. And a lot of that's from not getting the work order correct and not bringing the right materials. And we all know how expensive it is to send a crew or one individual, usually your foreman, when they've got to make a trip all the way back to a job and get that extra bag of tape or sand or another box of tape. So it goes right back to inventory and make sure you know the scope of work on that job as you start it. So that's what we really want to do, is make sure that we've got everything with us before we even start. I talk about jobs on when we start a project. It's always a good idea before that truck even goes out the door that crew leader or that production manager has got a checklist of everything that they need for that project. And if they've got all the materials, and usually maybe even an excess of material, maybe it's like a small 5% or 10%. So if they're driving 30 or 40 miles outside of the city limits of where your project is that they're going to have enough material to go ahead and finish that job for the day. And that comes from a checklist. I can't tell you how many times in my career that I've had a crew leader call me and say, you know what, we're a bag short, or we need 5 more gallons, and it ends up them either coming back to the shop or me going back out there to reach them. So knowing what you've got, knowing what you're going to need, and knowing what you're using and make everyone accountable for is really an effective way to keep track of your materials. You want to add to that anything, Joe? You got anything?
Well, Frank, I love the idea that you mentioned at the very end, the accountability part, because you've got to make the crews on the projects accountable for their, whether it's their equipment, their production supplies, whatever it might be. There's got to be some responsibility on their end. So I love that idea. You got to put a system in place that will actually uphold that.
You know, it's once that material's out on that job, how well is it being taken care of? Are they protecting it, especially some of our polymers and our stains, the specialty materials that we use on these decorative jobs? They're very sensitive materials, and they should be well protected. In other words, we don't want them out in direct sunlight. We don't leave them out into the weather. Make sure they're taken care of. And that same clean project needs to have the right equipment that's being put down on. And that means taking good care of all of our tools, our equipment. And I've also found too, and this has been over the years, that if I assign a project or a job to a crew and they're not really real capable or talented or trained enough to do that particular project, we're going to start to see wasted material. They usually use a little bit too much, or they have to do part of it over, and it's just a constant struggle. So I always try to match up my crews with the talent that they're capable, that they're able to do. And I've got a note here that says that to make sure that we recover the unused material that are on a job, in other words, leaving product behind, which it might be stain, it might be bags of material. Number one, the customer doesn't want it left on their job. We want to leave each and every one of these projects in clean condition. But it reminded me of a contractor that I met, and they used to leave a touch-up jar on every job, which was basically a pint of touch-up color. And I was looking at their job costs, and it seemed like they had spent an extra $10,000 on touch-up material that was not being accounted for. And we went back and talked to the crews, and come to find out, instead of leaving the pint jar, they ended up leaving 5-gallon buckets of the touch-up material. And we did a calculation on that, and over a period of a year and a half, that was $10,000 worth of material that was left behind on the job that could have gone back into the profit line, that bottom line that Mel talked about. So number one, we don't want to leave extra product that we don't have to, because our customer doesn't want it there. And number two, it needs to go to that next job.
Hey Frank, you have a note on here about experienced crew members should mix the product. I know you've harped on this for years and years and years about the inconsistencies and what happens to wasted materials and materials not being mixed correctly, and then having to basically start over on a mix, and how important that is to the recipe of the decorative concrete.
Yeah, and you know, Joe, that would include whether you're doing an overlay or you're doing a stain or you're doing cast-in-place concrete. It doesn't really matter, but to me, the lead guy on that job, he's the one that determines the mix design, whether it comes out of the truck. He's the guy, if it's an overlay, he's the one that determines exactly how that's to be mixed, because that's where your efficiency starts. If that material is mixed correctly, that means it's going to be applied correctly more than likely. And that means this guy has to know what that material spread is. What will be the yield of that product for that job? And this goes right back to our work order being correct. So we know the scope of work, we know how much material it's going to take, we know our ratios, we know the scope of the work, and it's going to be applied correctly. Now what that also does is that as we go back and look at our job costs, and if it all fits into a certain profile, we know that we're getting a certain yield for each part of our system. So when we evaluate, we go, yes, this crew knows what they're doing, we know it's being properly applied, we know we're getting the right performance out of that product. So if I've got a project where maybe it's clear finish coat, and I look at it and they're getting 1,000 square feet per gallon of an acrylic finish coat, probably tells me I'm not going to get proper protection. That means that job is probably going to have a problem later down the road. But if I look at my yields, and I know what the yield is for that particular manufacturer's product is, and I know it's spot on, this is the way it's going to perform for years and years and years, I know it's being applied correctly, that kind of gives me a quality control guideline as well. Then also, this goes back to the training. Whether it's a new system, you might want to retrain a lot. your crews, some of your existing systems. If you start to see things coming up in your job costs that don't dial in right, where they're not getting the proper yield, or you're starting to get callbacks on certain projects, now's a good time to bring those crews in, maybe on the off season. It's hard to do it right now, but in the off season or when you have inclement weather, bring these crews in and let's go back through the proper method of whether it's doing stamped concrete, or whether it's staining a floor, or whether we're polishing or we're dyeing. All these decorative systems sometimes takes a bit of re-education. And I strongly recommend too that our new crews that we bring in, let's give them the proper training they deserve. That means putting with experienced crew leaders and monitoring and coaching, get these guys to where they're effective for us. Also know that slow down and go faster, set at daily expectations. This reminds me of a young crew leader that I had in California, very talented young guy, but if you gave him more than 1,200 or 1,000 square feet of work to do in a day, his productivity went way down instead of going the direction it should have gone, because he was only trained, he only had a certain capability, he had a certain skill set. He was capable of doing 800 to 1,000 square feet of work a day. But as soon as I gave him more, his productivity went down, his crew went down, and it hurt the entire process. And we had to start going back working on his jobs.
See, and Frank, the thought process I think of a lot of contractors, especially in the heat of the season right now, is we're chasing the dollars so fast. We're chasing the customers who are calling in and asking for us to be, can we be there next week? And we get a little bit of rain and we're pushing the schedule. We then put that pushing onto the crews, and then what ends up happening is the inefficiencies on the job sites because they're hurrying through projects. Sometimes, like Frank just said, slow them down, let them know it's okay to slow down a bit to get the job done right correctly, because we end up paying for that eventually.
And kind of my last point too, this takes us, we've often talked about this in ASCC, is that are we bidding these jobs correctly? Are we actually getting the price that we should for these? In decorative concrete, all the work we do is very competitive, but many times we'll take jobs on that we probably shouldn't be taking on, or we try to bid against the chuck in the truck type guys, and we are basically driving that profit margin down by doing work we probably shouldn't be involved in, especially this time of the year. So it's really about a lot of paper management, or not a lot of paper management, but understanding the scope of work that we have, understanding that project, what it's really about, what the ratios are, what it takes to do it profitably. So when we get to the end of the project, we've got a nice bottom line. Now we can start spending some money. Now.
Well, Frank, thank you for those details. So we've talked a little bit today about the cost of goods sold and the direct material and what you can do, and efficiencies with securing that material, buying into some type of co-op or aligning yourself to be able to negotiate bulk pricing, what it means to have efficiencies with assigning the right crews to the right projects so you don't have excess material and have low quality, or have not enough material because of waste of not knowing how to install the system. All of those things that Frank spoke about really are highlighted or magnified on the profit and loss statement when you see that you're not hitting the correct percentage, that percentage we talked about of 50 or 60% of sales. So let's say your cost of goods sold is at 65%, 70%, you've got problems. And that's where you're going to need to dive into the details of cost of goods sold and determine, is this a material problem? Am I spending too much money on material? Or is it a direct labor problem? Well, next week we're going to focus on that direct labor, next series presentation in September, we're going to focus on direct labor and look at that. And then that parlays exactly into job costing. We're going to break down a job and see exactly how job costing works when you look at the direct material and the direct labor associated to a job, look at what you expected it to be versus what it turned out to be, and that will help you diagnose what your cost of goods sold issues are, and then be able to have you course correct so that you can bring more money to the bottom line. So with that, let me pull it back. I know there may be a few folks that have questions, but I do want to say that thank you very much for attending this webinar today. I hope it's been helpful for you. I've got our phone number and our email on the screen here, and you're welcome to do follow-up questions if you want to dig into the details of gross margin or cost of goods sold, and certainly reach out to Frank, Joe, or myself through this email address, and it will get routed to the correct person. And then we've got Wednesday, September 16th as our next webinar that's focusing in, again, on cost of goods sold and labor, and that's where we're going to take a deeper dive into that the job costing component. So, Joe, let me let you finish it up and wrap it.
Yeah, Mel, thanks so much. Thanks, Frank. So you say why? Why now? You guys are super busy. It's the middle of summer. Why are we doing this now? There's no better time than to start looking at the business, because now is when you're probably feeling the pains of what's going on. You're probably right down deep in the middle of it. And we're doing it now also because when we stair-step this process over the next 5 weeks, we're preparing. We're looking at the business versus working in it right now. We're trying to work on it in looking for next year. We're starting to maybe lay some groundwork on things you want to think about that you can start to work on, that planning for next year. By the time we wrap up in December, you're going to be raring to go, and spring will be here before you know it. So that's kind of why now and why we're doing this 5-part series. And the series will continue into next year and hopefully far into the future. But we're in the business of being decorative concrete people, and everybody can use a little bit of sharpening the saw, and that's what this is. So with that said, if we have any questions, Tiffany, I'll give it back to you, and we'll see everybody September 16th.
Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you. As a reminder, you may submit an online question using the Q&A feature to the right of your presentation. If you would like to ask a question over the phone, please press star, then 1 on your touchtone phone. Once again, if you have a question over the phone, please press star, then 1, or you may submit a question using the Q&A feature to the right of your presentation. And we are standing by for questions. And once again, that's star 1 for a question over the phone. And at this time, I am not showing any audio questions.
Okay, well, thanks again, and we'll hope to hear from everybody and see everybody September 16th and for the next 4 that we're going to do. So we'll see everybody then. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This does conclude today's conference. Thank you for participating. You may now disconnect.